The original Judgment was a flawed, if earnest, attempt at crossing legal drama with detective mystery. Sure, the mystery was as exciting as waiting in line at the self-checkout of your nearest discount grocery store, and the dialogue was pumped full of more fun facts than a bar owner hosting trivia night to keep the lights on, but it had promise. Takeya Kimura and Shinshu Fuji had great on-screen chemistry as Yagami and Kaito respectively. Scenes including the detective duo had a great balance of action, melodrama, and comedic timing. Though sporadic, chewing scenery as a detective in a classically long Ryu Ga Gotoku cutscene kept you invested in the Yagami character, even if what you were investing into was a detective who couldn't deduce himself out of a cardboard box. And of course, the fighting and play spots in Judgment carried the whole experience on its back, like a fire truck strapped to a sea turtle. Retaliating in self-defense by inflicting open head wounds had never felt so good, with the Dragon Engine finally delivering solid hit feedback, toning down the ragdoll effects, and making Yagami a technical fighter centered around precise combo attacks. Things weren't looking great, but there was room to grow and reason to believe improvement was certain in the event of a sequel. And a sequel we got. Lost Judgment sees the detective arrive in Yokohama with a singular mission: end bullying forever.
Oh, how does it feel now?
Just get going, would you?
Yeah, toss him out!
If Judgment was a friend with the chance to grow from their mistakes, then Lost Judgment is the friend who doubled down and made their mistakes their entire personality. Yakuza 6 was written by an angry man. Judgment was written by a man with his head in the clouds. Lost Judgment was written by a Nosferatu who hasn't left its crypt in 400 years. The plot twist to this cute joke I wrote is, all these entries have the same writer, Tsuyoshi Furuta, and at this point his writing, what I don't like about it anyway, can no longer be given the benefit of the doubt. I've got nothing against the man personally, but his work is infuriatingly unsatisfactory. Lost Judgment is no exception and a perfect microcosm of his weaknesses as a writer. Look, creating anything is hard. Writing is monumentally hard, and writing for games, especially games on tight deadlines, is excruciatingly difficult. But it's not like we don't have a point of reference for the quality standards we've come to expect from this studio. They're not exactly the next Nobel Prize candidates, but there are standout entries with captivating plot lines and meaningful subtext in RGG Studios' catalog. Tsuyoshi Furuta doesn't need to suck me silly from the back with the world's next piece of biblical storytelling. All he needs to do is deliver a satisfying, cohesive narrative on the level or in the range of a standard Ryu Ga Gotoku story. What he delivers with Lost Judgment is a confusing, convoluted tale that loses the strength of its messaging due to his over-reliance on bad writing techniques. Lost Judgment opens with Yagami and Kaito being called out to Yokohama to help another detective agency investigate bullying rumors being spread at a school. You might think this is beneath a detective who recently solved a murder case, but as I understand it, bullying is a serious issue in Japan. It's a perfectly reasonable premise for the game's target audience, and frankly, a nice de-escalation of the stakes and expectations set by the first Judgment's mystery. I only wish it maintained that de-escalation in the long run. Yagami meets with his old friends Tsukumo and Sugiura, and we're hit with an absurdly long explanation of bullying's evolutionary origins.
裏切り者をきっちり迫害した群れほど結果的に淘汰されずに済んだでしょう。つまりそれが私たちの祖先です。
We commonly see the overabundant use of trivia and surface-level knowledge, sometimes incorrect knowledge, as filler for dialogue in Furuta's work. The original Judgment put a complete stop to the plot a couple of times in order to get across statistics and flimsy facts about various issues. Although it did so sparingly, it felt like a hurried, inorganic way of getting across information. Information dumps, replacing metaphor or allegory, or really anything else which would have been more clever or engaging for the player. But someone must have thought this was compelling prose. These ham-fisted PSAs are in full force in Lost Judgment from the get-go, even invading the game's side cases. You might be wondering, what's so bad about adding fun facts into a dialogue scene where nothing is happening? This is exactly the problem. Nothing is happening. The Like a Dragon franchise is famous for its scene chewing, but there's nothing of the sort in Lost Judgment despite its cutscenes being equally long. Characters don't get up from where they're sitting to fiddle with objects in the background, and nobody walks towards a window to gaze out of it whimsically. The choreography in Lost Judgment severely lacks the proper blocking and business necessary to convey emotion through its visual aspects. I think at most we get one Dutch angle towards the end of the game to make the villain look slightly evil. It's mostly close-ups of each character back and forth as they mechanically read from a Wikipedia entry. I lose all focus during these cutscenes because they're blocked boringly, there's no visual stimulation, and what's being said isn't helping either. Once again, Furuta uses surface-level research and shoehorns a poor explanation for something before beating you over the head with it or creating a ridiculous premise for a resolution. The anti-bullying scene you saw earlier expresses a very superficial understanding of the bystander effect, and is so out of touch with reality that you'd think a child wrote it.
Well, damn. So much for my appetite. You guys are making me sick.
Hey, who the fuck said that?
How is it possible that these teenagers can't tell middle-aged voices aren't coming from their classmates? Like, no one is moving their mouths.
Unfucking believable that it takes 3 of them to do the job.
Seriously, you guys? You're taking Koda's side here?
Why aren't these kids getting expelled? Why is there this convoluted plot to keep the adults out of the situation at hand? Why aren't any of these teachers doing their fucking jobs? It's completely detached from real-life solutions to bullying. This is more frustrating when later on, Lost Judgment criticizes a teacher for not directly interfering in a case of bullying and uses that to emphasize the mistakes the character has made. And when they aren't reading off of your high school teacher's lesson notes, characters are constantly repeating the same information about the case over and over again, seemingly in fear of the player forgetting crucial plot details that were introduced just minutes ago in a prior cutscene. But this isn't Lost Judgment being afraid of players not being able to keep up. This is Lost Judgment's narrative barely hanging by a thread for multiple chapters until the writer writes himself out of the many holes he ends up in. Constantly coming to the same conclusions after having the same deliberations, Lost Judgment wants to cast the illusion that it has this deep mystery, but really peddles minor details continuously until the writer can find another one to BS their paper with. If I have to hear Yagami mention Sawa-sensei one more time, I'm going to explode. This constant strangling of a single part of the plot long after you've squeezed any interesting developments out of it creates a black hole of storytelling. New information is ripped apart and swallowed whole by a mass of redundancy. Lost Judgment? More like lost the fucking plot. Where the hell is it? This entanglement leaves me wondering exactly what the point of its message is. It clumsily juggles a bullying subplot alongside a conversation about the failings of the justice system and tries to equal out one and the other as the same exact thing, but the difference in stakes between the two creates such a gap of importance that every time we shift focus from one to the other, it feels like we've stumbled into a different title entirely. Once again, Takayuki Yagami sits in a room or talks to someone else for long periods of time and comes away from the conversation with barely anything new learned. Every character in Lost Judgment needs to be filled in completely about the events transpiring, even if it means forcing the player to listen to it again and again and again. It's almost as if Furuta is writing for vacant minds. Every detail and reasoning needs to be explicitly stated. The audience isn't expected to make natural inferences. The problem is, when you do this, when you explain everything repeatedly, you're bound to become inconsistent or contradict your own words, as opposed to your audience naturally filling in gaps or just, thinking about the scenes or the events at play. The writing comes off as incredibly insecure of its own clarity, and it's easier for the story to fall apart this way. Characters themselves never interject with personal anecdotes or interrupt the trivia bombardment to add color to the scene. There's zero flavor from what should be an eccentric, fun cast, unless that flavor comes in the form of assassinating Kaito's character. In Judgment, he was a reliable, sturdy partner. In Lost Judgment, Kaito is relegated to making womanizing comments about people and drinking a lot. It's like someone wrote Kaito as a caricature of himself. Takeya Kimura is wasted here. Let's get one thing straight. This is the lead actor for one of Japan's most famous TV dramas. This man can act. This man has fantastic comedic timing, but we barely ever get to see his range of emotion. Furuta doesn't seem to view his characters as people with personalities or representations of the ideas he wishes to convey. Characters being themselves isn't how he gets a point across or establishes the themes in the stories he's telling. They're just mannequins with speakers strapped to their faces, transparently touting whatever take Furuta has on whichever issue he wants to talk about in any particular scene. This clashes with his insistence on writing a character-driven story, as is the Ryu Ga Gotoku custom. Scenes where Yagami gets angry at his own shortcomings, or one where tension between two characters should be thicker than my thighs and skinny jeans, are numbed by us ultimately not really seeing these characters as people. Sure, both Yagami and Kuwana agree that the justice system fails people and disagree on the methods to correct it, but we know this via them having several deep and meaningfuls in the back of a McDonald's parking lot. It's not necessarily backed up through their actions or deeds. We might as well have been reading their Twitter feeds. Especially in Kuwana's case, who, just like Judgment's villains, makes short and rare appearances, signposting that he's a bad guy, despite Lost Judgment thinking it's clever for doing the same thing twice. And doing the same thing twice is a strong descriptor for Lost Judgment. There's a ton of narrative similarities between Judgment and Lost Judgment that some might consider a clever choice, but to me feels like proof of an absence of new ideas. Both plots eventually escalate to involve the Vice Minister of the Ministry of Health. Both fridge a woman Yagami meets in order to give him motivation to pursue the case. Both feature a mole character, which is stressed by the game itself.
知ってるかターボ潜入捜査官はアメリカなんかじゃモグラって呼ばれてるらしいぜモグラか
Both feature Yagami partaking in his lawyerly duties at the end of the game. Both end with Yagami and his group of friends storming a location together, and both implicate a branch of law enforcement in the schemes of the villain. Both feature two segments where Saori, Yagami's lawyer friend, dresses up to go undercover, even returning to the exact same cabaret club she did in the first game. Both also have similar openings, with Yagami chasing down a suspect, fighting them, and then flashing his lawyer's badge at them. There's probably many more to discover in Lost Judgment, but I think you get the idea. When Lost Judgment isn't ripping off its predecessor, it's doing a disservice to the world building done by its peers. Like a Dragon established the Yokohama Lumang and the Gomi Jewel as criminal organizations with a nuanced relationship with the people of Yokohama, groups born out of necessity working towards survival. Lost Judgment reduces both of these groups to gangs with masks, using familiar ideas in watered-down ways to gain points for referencing a previous title, but losing more in authenticity and squandering a chance to add to continuity. But above all, I have to ask the important question: who exactly is Lost Judgment for? According to countless interviews, Ryu Ga Gotoku designs these games for adult Japanese men. So then why does a large portion of Lost Judgment revolve around joining the various high school clubs and making Yagami seem like the coolest, raddest dude to ever exist? Don't get me wrong, the school stories of Lost Judgment are some of the best written content of the game, more on that later, but there's this weird feeling I get watching Yagami participate in the various club activities with the target audience in mind. He's a power fantasy, and an embarrassing one at that. Yagami can skate, he can dance, he's good at Virtua Fighter, he can box, he's good at robotics, he fights bullies, everyone loves him. If Lost Judgment is a game for adult Japanese men, then it's also a game for adult Japanese men to relive their high school years as the coolest, most badass, ripped 38-year-old around, and with license to beat their teenage bullies up in brutal martial arts combat. Now look, I enjoy a good high school power fantasy from time to time, but there's a big difference between Persona 5 and Lost Judgment. Around 20 years of difference. Not that an age gap has ever stopped Yagami before. Who knows, maybe it's just a coincidence they aged up Yagami's love interests in Lost Judgment. Or maybe they did it because they realized if they let him date 20-year-olds again, he'd look like a sexual predator in the high school setting half the game was going to take place in. It's a 2-year gap from graduating high school to getting picked up by a guy pushing 40 is all I'm saying, but hey, clearly it is a mystery. Pay no attention to the DLC adding a 20-year-old girl to the roster of available romances. I'm sure they rolled some dice to randomly select her age and definitely didn't make a conscious decision to include someone so young as one of Yagami's girlfriends. I'm sure that choice wasn't a choice at all, but I digress. Listen, if you like the story in Lost Judgment and find it compelling and truly gripping, more power to you. As for me, I'd rather eat a brick until my teeth fall out. But hey, you don't have to watch this sort of thing and get upset at me anymore. Just assume from now on, if Furuta's the one writing the script on a Like a Dragon game, that I'm probably not going to like it. That'll save you about 15 minutes every video. Between the shoddily put together narrative and poor use of the cast, Lost Judgment basically lost me from chapter 1, but there was still some hope that I'd enjoy its gameplay a great deal more than its story. This turned out to be the case, but not without a few caveats.
Why is he throwing... Did he just throw his friend at me? What the f***? He just threw his dude at me. How'd they figure out where you're standing on the top of the boat? You're standing on top of a boat. You're standing on top of a boat in the middle of a dock where everybody can f***ing see you. That's how they knew you were there. You're standing on top of a f***ing boat where everybody can f***ing see you at the f***ing carnival. There's a f***ing Ferris wheel right behind you. You're standing on top of a f***ing landmark, a tourist attraction. What do you mean, how do they find you? You're standing on top.
When I said Judgment didn't follow through with mechanics, I meant I wanted them present in more parts of the game. The original entry had these tiny systems I really enjoyed. Being rewarded for asking the right questions during interviews and interrogations, presenting a string of correct evidence while you've cornered a suspect, and investigating a crime scene efficiently. They helped separate Judgment from the Ryu Ga Gotoku formula, turning long in-game cutscenes into new gameplay segments and immersing the player into the detective role. We could chew the scenery alongside the actors by having input into how the scenery was chewed, but they were used sparingly. Judgment was afraid to distance itself from its Like a Dragon roots. It didn't indulge enough in what set it apart, and honestly, you can't blame it for playing it safe. But with enough support to make a sequel, you'd think those ideas would return in a stronger capacity. You'd expect Lost Judgment to pull even further away from Like a Dragon to establish a stronger, independent identity. Lost Judgment doesn't just push back on its detective elements in favor of a more generic Like a Dragon experience, it does away with them entirely. You're no longer pushed to ask the right questions or present the right evidence on the first try. Those are replaced with sections where you're forced to choose every dialogue prompt and investigate every point of interest in order to move forward. This isn't entirely different from Judgment, where choosing incorrectly prevented you from gaining experience points during the interaction, but the illusion of choice is non-existent in Lost Judgment. We aren't given as many opportunities to act like a detective would or should, and it becomes harder for us to resonate with the Yagami character. Once again, we catch the Judgment series in a horrible lesson of show, don't tell. I'm less like Yagami and more like the nephew he brought in to take your child to work day. I don't want to watch Yagami be a detective. I want to be a detective while playing as Yagami. I want to be rewarded for being a good detective. I don't want to be held by the hand through the office. Lost Judgment's washed out detective elements include pulling away from tailing missions. Apparently, people didn't like how many tailing missions the original Judgment had, so for Lost Judgment, we get fewer but longer tailing missions, and this is a huge mistake. If you reduce the number of tailing missions but increase the length of existing tailing missions, then depending on how much longer you're making each one, the amount of time we spend in tailing missions can end up being the same. Only now, every tailing mission absorbs the inertia of the advancing narrative and slows everything down to a crawl. Personally, I didn't take much issue with Judgment's tailing missions. They were short, sweet, and flexible when it came to hiding from your target. Lost Judgment's tailing missions are ambitious. We get an emergency hide button, the target's behavior changes the more aware of our presence they become, and more hiding spots are built into the map. But these additions don't mean as much when there's only a handful of tailing missions to get acclimated to them. What Lost Judgment adds to the series' detective gameplay is an annoying stealth minigame not worth talking about. You have to crouch walk to marked positions on the map where you can activate an ability that only works when you're standing on those marked positions, so you can take down enemies or walk past them. Sometimes the places you have to stealth to aren't even properly hidden from an enemy's cone of vision, and you can get slapped in the face with a game over screen for following the directions. Man alive, it sucks. A stealth minigame is a clear choice for a detective game featuring a dexterous, nimble protagonist like Yagami, but Lost Judgment's attempt at stealth is stiff, one-dimensional, and finicky. Even though its story makes me want to dip my entire head in a vat of spicy mayonnaise until the burning in my eyes eats its way into my frontal lobe, Lost Judgment features the series' best play spots and/or minigames yet, except for the motorcycle races. Those are bad. It's not because these play spots are monumentally different or better from previous entries, it's because they're given world-building significance and are the vehicle for a much more interesting subplot than whatever the hell the main scenario is trying to do. Each play spot is represented by a different after-school club Yagami must help advise in order to gain information about a mysterious figure leading otherwise exceptional students down a life of delinquency. As he chases each lead, Yagami is pulled into the dilemmas each group of students is faced with, and through reasoning and empathy helps them overcome various challenges. The school stories are all wrapped together through the Mystery Research Club, a small group dedicated to solving the school's various mysteries, with Yagami as head advisor. Each school club features its own unique play spot, but the primary clubs you'll focus on have in-depth mechanics and border on being the size of small indie games. The boxing mode has its own fighting system consisting of various opponents with different boxing styles, each with their own flaws and openings you have to learn. The Robotics Club features a territory grab game where you and two AI players try to Tetris piece together more territory than your opponents. Your robots can be customized to the nines, and enemy robots all exhibit different objectives and purposes. The Dance Club is a rhythm game with its own track list, and the motorcycle races are bad. Just terrible. Why did you include rubber banding during the racing portions? This is awful. The school stories subplot is so well done, it should have been the central storyline to Lost Judgment, where advancing in these clubs led you further and further through the mysterious murder case via assisting the students with their own problems, gaining their favor and trust, and cracking the bullying lead wide open. Unlike the main scenario of Lost Judgment, the school stories have a ton of heart and build up Yagami's authenticity as a person. With the luxury of age, Yagami uses his personal experience to help talk through each student's problems. Instead of making it about himself or hounding them with question after question, he works on forming a meaningful connection with each student before interviewing them about the mysterious suspect leading them astray. We learn a little more about Yagami himself through the way he reacts to every outburst or altercation between the students themselves, with patience and understanding. This is contrasted with almost every teacher involved in the school clubs turning up their noses at the students' issues, being largely absent despite their duties, or outright trying to shut the clubs down for the sake of their own convenience. For a game that opens up with bullying in a high school, it makes a lot of sense for the rest of it to continue taking place in the high school itself. This way, the focus can remain on Lost Judgment's message. Bullying is bad, and we should do something about it. Alas, this isn't the case. The school stories highlight how superficial Lost Judgment's message on bullying is. It's less about bullying being a serious issue, and more like a game using bullying as a paper-thin reason to have action scenes and melodrama. If Lost Judgment is trying to say something true and beautiful, it probably should have focused more on the children bullying actually affects, like the school stories do. But as is, this little subplot makes the rest of the narrative in Lost Judgment feel disingenuous and opportunistic. We owe the school stories of Lost Judgment to one Hironao Fukuda and whoever worked alongside or under them during development. They were credited for the school stories and side cases script and direction. We have them to thank for those. But not for the motorcycle races. My god, the motorcycle races are bad. Hidonao Fukuta's mark on Lost Judgment extends further than the confines of its base game. The Kaito Files, a standalone expansion starring Shinsu Fuji as the eponymous character, is easily some of the best writing this franchise has ever produced. And Fukuda, not Furuta, is credited as the scriptwriter for it. The Kaito Files makes Lost Judgment look like a cancelled pilot episode, and I mean this in a good way. In blowing Lost Judgment out of the water and into the nearest dumpster, it simultaneously justifies the work done by both Judgment games. It proves the Judgment franchise is sitting on a colorful cast of characters that, when used appropriately or given more to do, can deliver a strong, compelling world with stakes and tension, even without Yagami. Yagami is completely absent from the Kaito Files, save for a few text messages he sends Kaito, but this works out in favor of RGG Studios. The vacuum left behind in Kimura's absence leaves a ton of room for Fuji to establish himself as a strong lead actor, maybe even one who can carry the series with or without Kimura. It wouldn't surprise me if this expansion was a testbed to see if they could move on with the series without Takeya Kimura's presence. Like I said in the original Judgment video, Kaito is a much stronger candidate for a detective mystery set in Kamurocho. He has a strong connection to the city and the people living there, and his background makes it easy for him to find leads where others couldn't. Kaito's connection to the underground crime world helps him recognize the calling cards of ex-Yakuza, and he knows how to move within the underground to extract information and hunt people down. In a world where the Yakuza are basically gone and the remnants are up to their no-good schemes, Kaito is a fantastic foil against any would-be villains he's pitted against. And this is exactly how the Kaito Files starts.
So, you take the client's money up front. Then you shake down the mark for another $4 million on top. Man, you corrupt detectives really rake it in, don't you?
Who the fuck? Shit. You were in the Matsugane.
And you're Shiro Senda. You were a former lieutenant in the Bato family. And right now, you're on my turf.
It's the perfect introduction to our protagonist's abilities, showcasing his competence, his cleverness, his gumption. It also handily writes out a bunch of the side characters we're used to seeing in Judgment with a short segment where they're all too busy with their personal interests to go out to drink with Kaito. The Kaito Files establishes our detective is more than your standard gumshoe, and also introduces us to an aspect of Kaito we haven't seen before: loneliness. Fukuda chose to show the moments in Judgment when Kaito is left to his own devices. He's a man with plenty of friends, but at a loss on what to do with himself when he's alone. The Kaito Files explores this loneliness in detail, giving us a glimpse into Kaito's past and eventually throwing him into a mystery revolving around a lost love. Not every detective story needs this personal element added to the stakes, but when Judgment and Lost Judgment both attempt and fail to give Yagami a strong enough emotional connection to the work he's doing, it's nice to have one that actually has significance. At a time when Kaito is most vulnerable, in enters a ghost from his past, and despite his best efforts to push it away, a living embodiment of what could have been arrives at his doorstep. The Kaito Files doesn't spit out verbatim what these characters mean to the subtext of the story. It's confident players will pick up on those things on their own. It spends its time fleshing these characters out through action rather than words. Again, this isn't anything special, but after banging my bloodied forehead against a wall for the last 80 hours of my video game playing life, this might as well win an Oscar. The Kaito Files might be predictable, but uses it to its advantage. It employs the wonderful escalation of melodrama the Ryu Ga Gotoku series is best known for. It's full of over-the-top moments that turn the predictability on its head to surprise us, like when villains perform displays of strength or commit horrible acts of violence. It's a red herring that lulls us into a false sense of security so that we react strongly to the real surprises in the story. The Kaito Files has some of the best setup and payoff I've seen out of the RGG franchise. Things like a character's fear of knives being set up early in the story so that he can later overcome it at the end. A great conclusion to that character's story arc, but also a fantastic way to turn the tables on the villain at the end. Plot elements coming together like this had me cheering the main cast on, and honestly had me buying into the tension of not knowing what would happen next. I was completely hooked, and it helped that I could finish the Kaito Files in one long sitting. It's a remarkably short game and continues to establish this trend of shorter Ryu Ga Gotoku narratives and games coming out better than their larger counterparts. These condensed experiences keep turning out great. They're always hyper-focused on the core themes they want to establish and explore, and they rarely pad themselves out in the way we all know Like a Dragon games do. The Kaito Files being so successful at what it does makes a great case for more small experiences from RGG Studios becoming a mainstay of their lineup, and I think it's why Like a Dragon Gaiden exists. It's evidence that RGG Studio is capable of distilling what makes their entries so inviting, and I hope it's a trend that continues. But notice what's happened here. We've stopped talking about Lost Judgment in terms of its own series, because it isn't anymore. It's a Like a Dragon game through and through. Whatever hope RGG Studios had of establishing a separate series with a shared universe died with Judgment. The departure from the unique detective elements, adding in more play spots and silly scenarios to create that wacky dichotomy, the attempt at a grounded detective drama failed. From now on, the Judgment series is just going to feel like a spin-off in the same way Lost Paradise and Dead Souls were. Examples of interesting takes on the formula, not exactly evidence of RGG Studios being able to branch off into something else entirely. Judgment and Lost Judgment make me increasingly frustrated the longer I play them. But as far as the sequel goes, hey, the highs are higher, the gameplay's tighter, and the lows make me want to chew nails. Much like with Judgment, it's hard for me to tell you not to play it because there's a lot of fun to be had with the school stories and the Kaito Files. The fighting in it feels just as fantastic as it did in the first Judgment too. Nothing much to write about otherwise, but yeah. And while my throbbing disdain for Furuta's writing is reaching a breaking point, I can tolerate it to enjoy Fukuda's contributions to the work. I don't know, these Judgment games are weird. They're not the worst, but they're so bad for so many reasons, and yet they have really good gameplay segments. Do with this video what you will. Do with the Judgment series what you will. But take my advice. Just skip the main scenario cutscenes.